Thank you for joining us for Talk with Toni. We just completed our 2020 budget process, and I have with me our Budget Director, Tanya Anthony, and our Bureau Chief for Finance, Ammar Rizki. And we're going to begin with you, Tanya. You know, I think sometimes our viewers don't have a sense of public servants and kind of how they got to where they are. So you're our Budget Director, but it's kind of been an interesting path to this point. So tell us about that.
It has. So next year marks 25 years of local government
Public service
career for me. And you're right, it had a very interesting start. In '95, I was actually a correctional officer at the Department of Corrections, Division 9, for 5 years.
The jail,
at
for people
the jail.
who don't know. Yes, the jail. Okay.
At the jail, maximum security for men. So
that was an interesting experience. How did you end up there?
I was in the military,
Okay.
and I actually come from a long line of correctional officers.
Okay.
Both my parents and my sister and my brother are all in law enforcement, as well as my husband. So coming from the military, it just seemed like a logical progression. My undergrad is in criminal justice, so it just seemed like the logical place to go to start my career. But while I was there, I determined that I wanted to do something different. So my mentor told me what I really wanted to do is become a budget analyst, because you learn so much about public service.
It's kind of a big jump from a correctional officer to a budget analyst. How did you make that jump?
So there's really a logical transition. It doesn't seem like it. So there used to be a division for investigators in the budget office at the city of Chicago.
Okay.
So I went from being a correctional officer to an investigator, which actually makes sense. But the investigation was all about waste and fraud and abuse. And so it was
in city government.
In city government, right. So it was under the budget office. Well, they found that there was some duplication of work between what we were doing and what the Inspector General's office was doing. So they decided to disband our unit. So at that time, I started making my plea to become a budget analyst. I was like, I have a undergrad in criminal justice. You need a budget analyst in the public safety area. I'm the person for the job. So after talking to a few folks, and they were looking for a place to transition me anyway, that's the place I ended up. So I was a budget analyst for public safety departments for 2 years, and then I became the assistant director of finance for the fire department. And then I got a phone call from the Park District saying they're looking for a budget director.
The Chicago Park District.
Chicago Park District, yes. So I didn't think I was ready, but apparently they did. They saw had confidence in me that I probably didn't have in myself at the time. But I went on to be the budget director for the Chicago Park District for 6 years, and then promoted to chief administrative officer at the Park District for 3 years. And then I got the call from the county. And they were like, we need a budget director. Would you consider it? It's like, I will talk to someone about it. And here we are, 5 budgets later, and I've enjoyed the job so far.
Yeah, I think sometimes people think like there's some magic straight line between one job to another, but in fact, for most of us in our careers, it's kind of a zigzag, right?
Yeah, it was absolutely a zigzag for me. You know, I think most parents say, go to high school, go to college. I actually diverted to the military for 4 years and then went to college. So yeah, it was quite a bit of a zigzag for me. And who knew as a correctional officer I would end up being the budget director.
Right, and you're about to become the Bureau Chief for Administration, so
yes.
That's on the way as well.
Yes.
All right, but let's talk to Ammar here a little bit. So Ammar, a different path to your present position as Bureau Chief. Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So I have one of the unique honors to serve you since the start of your administration.
Sure enough.
I think there's only 4 or 5 people left in your cabinet of that tenure. So I actually came from the private sector, and you know, I was at the time when I started, it was under your predecessor, and I used to classify myself as a recovering banker. So this is right after the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. I had just graduated from the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business, and so things were tough in the banking and the financial world in general. At that time, whenever things are tough, usually government is a great place to look
find
at,
employment.
to find employment, and that's what I did. I got a really good opportunity in the Department of Revenue, and that was in 2010. And so next year I will be celebrating my 10th year anniversary here at the county, and I've got the unique honor to move up the ranks through now to become the Bureau Chief and Chief Financial Officer for Finance.
Sure enough.
And
Now your own personal story is interesting.
So yes, I came to the U.S. in 1998 from Pakistan, and so unlike a lot of immigrants who come to the United States to seek economic opportunity, I came for educational opportunities. So I come from a relatively well-to-do background in Pakistan, but you know, America is known for great education.
Great universities.
And so, you know, I came here, went to University of Illinois at Chicago for my undergrad, and I finished that. Started working in finance and investments, and I went through the ranks of coming up in the private sector, and then applied to University of Chicago's Booth School of Business and got in. Timing was unfortunate. In 2008, you know, when I graduated, you know, financial world was
pretty bad.
Yeah, crashing all around us. But you know, whenever you have those types of calamities, there are opportunities within them, and that's this is when an opportunity presented itself around making sure that we can make a career in public sector, which I'd honestly speaking had not considered. But you know, looking back over the past decade, it's one of the best decisions I made because the breadth of experience that I've gotten, and I've been able to contribute around both with my academic skill sets as well as the skill sets acquired in the private sector, and some of the nuances I learned in the public sector, learning from you and some of the other folks that we've worked here, is just amazing in terms of personal and professional growth. And so, you know, having that shift from being an immigrant to being educated and working in the private sector to now being in service of the residents of Cook County is a big you know, learning experience, and it's an amazing experience for me so far.
Good, good. Let me ask you something. Do you still have family in Pakistan? Or?
I do. My parents and my sister and her husband live in Pakistan, so I do.
I know you go
visit
back
them
periodically.
Yes,
so.
I do go back every year or so. Try to visit them, and so does my wife. My wife she's from there too, and so we do visit our you know, parents. Try to visit them at least once a year.
Very good, very good. So we've heard Tanya and Ammar's fascinating personal stories, and now I'd like to shift a little bit and ask them kind of about their government role. So we're going to start with you, Ammar, because you're the bureau chief.
Yes.
Okay. So what's the Bureau of Finance responsible for?
Sure. So the Bureau of Finance has 6 different departments underneath it, and 7th is my own office, the Office of Chief Financial Officer. And so you would think about your traditional financial functions like revenue, procurement, budget, Controller's Office, which does our accounting and accounts payable and payroll, risk management, as well as our business diversity efforts in our contract compliance department.
Okay, so let's start with each of those real quick, what they are.
Sure. So in the Department of Revenue, we are responsible for collecting all the home rule taxes and fines and fees for the county.
That's property taxes, sales taxes, whatever.
Right, it's sales taxes, our cigarette taxes, things like that we have around the county. In our budget office, obviously responsible for creating and managing our budget on an annual basis. Our risk management department is responsible for managing our health benefits for our entire employees. Along with that, they also manage all our liabilities and self-insurance related functions. Procurement.
Self-insured, we get sued sometimes.
That's
and
right.
We have to pay out settlements, and so that's...
That is correct. So we have a number of claims around you know, settlements that we have to do. So our risk management office manages that entire apparatus. Our procurement office, and tied with that very closely, is our business diversity efforts. Our contract compliance manages the procurement or purchasing of all the county's goods and services. And contract compliance makes sure that the county has a goal of making sure that 35% of all our contracts are tried to give into minorities and women-owned businesses. And so they make sure that that is being adhered to. And then lastly but not least, my own office, the Office of Chief Financial Officer, where we manage the county's debt as well as financial forecasting and some of the project management functions. And so if you look at it from the breadth of the Bureau of Finance, the CFO specifically, has to make sure that the overall financials of the county from the start of the year to the end of the year and everything in between are being managed to their best of abilities. My office looks over the 5-year period, making sure that everything we're doing today, we're not setting ourselves up for failure 5 years from now. Transitioning that to how the budget office looks at things, they're looking at it on an annual basis. So things, what's coming up over the next year, and then making sure once the budget has been approved by the board, making sure we're adhering to that, and all our elected offices and using agencies are adhering to that.
Okay, so we're going to ask Tanya in a minute about the annual budget, but your responsibilities are to take a longer view of our finances and revenues and expenses and try to predict where we're going to be down the road as well as where we're going to be a year from now, right?
Correct.
Okay, and that's a challenge. That's a challenge in part because we have separately elected officials. It's not all under our control. 11 separately elected officials in Cook County.
Yes.
Plus we have a health and hospital system that has a separate independent governing board.
Yes.
So it's a real challenge to kind of make all the parts fit together.
That is. It is something that is much more difficult because you do have these separate silos. We like to say that there's not one CEO, there's 11 of them who are managing our entire organization. But when you have that type of a structure, the one big thing that works in that structure is collaboration. And that's something that we've learned from you, and we instill that not in ourselves in our daily works, but across our entire organization. We like to collaborate with our separate elected officials and our health system to make sure that they understand our point of view and we understand their point of view. They have a lot of times they have valid points of view too that we have to understand and undertake. And we have to make sure then, keeping everything in mind, we have a balanced view and move forward accordingly.
Okay. All right, so Tanya, you're responsible for the annual budget. What does that mean?
So that means that I work with all of the 11 separately elected officials to develop the spending plan for each fiscal year. So our fiscal year starts December 1st and goes all the way through November 30th of each year. So we work with each office, like collaborating, communication is really, really big to understand the priorities of each of those 11 separately elected offices. We develop a spending plan, and then we present it to the commissioners for their approval, which is what we just did. And then we're moving right on December 1, and then our goal is to manage within the limitations of those appropriations. So that's pretty much the annual spending plan that I'm responsible for developing and managing.
Okay, so you have a hard job because on one hand you have to manage the budget that's in place, and the other hand you have to be preparing the budget for the next year.
Right. So as we're developing the current year budget or developing the, we're looking at maybe 3 years at a time, really. So right now we're still managing the 2019 budget, and at the same time we're planning for the 2020 budget. But every time we develop a budget, we're really looking to make sure that we are doing something structural in that budget to have an impact in the future years.
What does structural mean?
So structural basically means that we're making decisions in the current time that has an impact in future years. So, for example, we are making decisions of not one-time fixes or furlough days. So a furlough day, if we have to solve for a budget deficit, it will absolutely take care of that current year. But then the following year, the problem still exists.
You have the same problem.
We'll have the same problem. So what we do is we try to make decisions that will have lasting impact. So when we make the decision this year, it not only impacts the current fiscal year or the ensuing fiscal year, but the future years as well. And so that's how we've been able to address some of the budget deficits that we've had. We've had the lowest budget deficit since your administration began of $18.6 million. This is the lowest. When you came in, it was like
487.
$480,
$500 million almost.
Almost $500 million. And then this year, we projected 2020 to be at 18.6. That's because of some of the structural decisions that we've made that have an impact in lasting years. We see the benefit of that year after year.
All right. Okay, I think budgets are really hard to understand, and I guess I'd be grateful if you'd talk a little bit about how the budget process has changed in the 5 years that you've been here with us. I mean, how has it improved? How has their fiscal situation changed, maybe?
Okay, so there are a few things that we focus on in finance. One thing is ensuring that we are okay with making those tough decisions, and the other thing is being disciplined in order to continue with those tough decisions because we made them for a reason. And then the last thing is ensuring that we are making sure that our finances are not growing faster than our revenue or faster than the rate of inflation. So, for example, when I started in 2015, everyone was looking at pensions, trying to figure out how do we address pension. Everyone was going downstate, trying to get their pension bills done.
In Springfield, with the state legislature.
Right, and there were no, I guess, positive outcomes. And so at that time, you made the tough decision to raise the property tax to address our pension.
Raise the sales tax.
Right, I'm sorry, right, raise the sales tax. So you made the tough decision to raise the sales tax in order for us to do a few things. One of them was to address our pension. The other thing that did for us is we were able to address our debt service as well as infrastructure. Now, there have been a couple of tough budgets after that, but where the discipline comes in is that even in a tough budget, we have held the line and continued to make those additional pension payments, and they've been very successful for us. Where we are now, and Ammar can opine on this a little bit more, is we've been able to address our unfunded pension liability by making almost, in 2020, we'll be at $1.3 billion with a B, of additional pension contributions above and beyond the statutorily required payment. And so we've been able to do that and hold the line on it. We are currently at about 61%,
That's right?
61% funded ratio. Without these additional payments, we would have been at around 55. Even 55 is better than some of the other larger pension funds. So that has been really successful for us. When we also talk
Just
about...
now, what does unfunded liability mean? That's a word that people may hear a lot. What does it mean, actually?
You want to
Sure.
answer that?
So what unfunded liability means, basically, there are a number of retirees and a number of active employees that currently there's an obligation owed to them around pensions.
When they retire, they'll get a
When
pension.
they retire, they'll get a pension. So when you combine all of those sort of benefits, if you will, that are owed to not just the retirees but the current people who are active that are earning those benefits, that overall number is the full liability that a pension fund has.
The pensions that are owed to the existing retirees and the people who are presently employees who will retire.
Exactly.
Okay.
Now the unfunded part is, so it's funded in the sense of there's assets in the pension fund that can cover all of those liabilities to make sure when the payments do come due, they have the money to be able to pay them. The unfunded part is basically that they don't have the money for that. And there's two ways to get that. Either somebody else has to pay, or you reduce the benefit to make sure you reduce that liability. And so that's where the unfunded liability comes into place. This is the gap between what is completely owed and what the assets total the pension fund has today.
Okay. So it's the amount of money you need to pay all the benefits and the amount of money you have.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. So we've made it a point in Talk with Toni to do book reviews. And this time I'd like to share with you a book that I'm reading, America Behind the Color Line. America Behind the Color Line by Henry Louis Gates. Now, Henry Louis Gates is probably the most prominent African-American public intellectual in the country. And he was just in Chicago for the Chicago Humanities Festival, and I was blessed to be able to hear him speak, which was fascinating. And I realized that I had several books on my shelf that he had written that I hadn't read, and I decided to start with this one, America Behind the Color Line. It's a series of interviews with prominent African Americans and some not so prominent, talking about their lives and about the African American community. I encourage you to take a look at it, America Behind the Color Line. Thank you. I've talked a lot about racial equity, and one of the ways in which we show our commitment to racial equity is in the way in which we prioritize decisions in our budget-making process. So, Tanya, how have we made racial equity a focus in the budgetary process this year?
Okay, well, it all starts with setting the priorities. And so once the priorities are set, we take a look at how we're allocating our resources. And so one good example of that is the priorities that have been set around public safety. So we have looked at and did our analysis. We understand that we are concerned with the number of black and brown men and women being detained in our adult detention facility. And so what we've done there is we've taken a look. We know that the population has declined from 10,000 many years ago to just under 6,000.
That's an average daily population.
Average daily population behind the walls of the jail. And so we are able to demolish some of those divisions, but there's savings coming out of that because we've been able to do that. We're shifting those resources to areas where we're providing more services to men and women to keep them from behind the walls. And so here's how we take a look at it. We try to eliminate any of the burdens on communities of color, but provide more of a benefit to communities of color. So what we've been able to do is shift those resources from behind the walls and provide more grants to recidivism reduction. We've been able to provide more services around workforce development, violence, yes. And so we've been able to shift those resources and provide more of a benefit to communities of color. But then we've made some tough decisions that may not be the best decision for our bottom line, but it's absolutely the right decision for racial equity. For example, we took a look at one of our contracts. And at one point, that contract was structured for the county to actually make a profit. We've restructured that contract so that the county's not making a profit.
This is on phone calls in the jail.
This is the phone calls in the jail contract, right? So we're not making.
Why don't you talk historically about what went on there?
Okay, so
because it was a cash cow.
Well, at one point we had this contract where we made a certain amount of money on top of every phone call a detainee would make to their loved ones, and you like, okay, they're paying this higher amount to make a phone call, but at the same time we're making money. So like, no, that isn't right. So we're going to stop making a profit and make the cost of making those phone calls for the detainee lower. And so we are in turn providing more of a benefit and less of a burden, so the inmates or the detainees can actually call their loved ones at a lower rate, and we're okay with sacrificing the revenue that we would have gotten because it was the right thing to do. We've done the same thing we used to get a federal payment called the State Criminal Alien Assistance Program from the federal government, where we would actually be reimbursed for the cost of detaining undocumented people. And so we made the decision that we were no longer going to receive that revenue from the federal government. And so
we weren't going to identify the undocumented because that would subject them to deportation.
Right, so our role was to provide information of who we're detaining. The federal government would actually determine what their status was. But once they determine what the status was, then they take our information, determine the status, and then they reimburse us. But we decided we didn't want to take part of that anymore. So those are two examples where we have shifted kind of the burden, where we are okay with not benefiting from the cost or benefiting our bottom line, but providing more of coverage because of our commitment to racial equity. Those two things alone, about $4 million to our budget, but it's the right thing to do from a racial equity lens.
Just to piggyback off of that, in the area of health. And so another big part of the county's mandates is public health. And we talked about our debt being reduced over the years as we've been very, very judicious in terms of how we manage our debt. What that has allowed us to make sure that we have capacity to invest in communities where it's most needed to round some of these elements. And so as part of that debt reduction that we've done over the past decade, where our debt is down by 8.2%, we've now been successfully able to make capacity to invest in underserved communities from a health perspective. Chicago, unfortunately, much like a lot of the United States, has been historically underfunded in some of these very critical communities or underserved communities, not just from a healthcare perspective, from all kinds of perspective. And health is a fundamental human right. And so by
the way, the most notorious example of this of these health disparities is that the life expectancy in Englewood is 60 years, and the life expectancy in Streeterville, which is just north of the Loop, is 90 years.
That's right.
So there's a 30-year
difference. And so to right that wrong that has happened for such a long time, the county is now able to invest in those communities that have been underserved. And as part of that, our health system is taking on initiatives to redo Providence Hospital, open a number of clinics that will serve those underserved communities and sort of at least take a attempt to right this
Address
historical
the health disparities
disparity that we have. And so that's another way we've looked at it, by making sure that we can align our capital budget to help some of these equity efforts that the county is undertaking.
Okay. Well, thank you, Tanya Anthony and Ammar Rizki, for joining us on Talk with Toni.